My name is Gordon Sander. I'm an American journalist and historian who has been visiting and writing about Finland for over 30 years. I'm the author of 3 books about Finland, including my latest book, Child, Citizen Kekkonen. This is a historical biography of Urho Kekkonen, the longtime president of Finland, who was also president during my first visit to Finland in 1977 when I was a student many centuries ago. So I have something of a memory of what Finland was like during the Kekkonen time. I felt that there wasn't one book which told the story of the whole man and his times. And I didn't think it would take me 8 years to write it, but so it did. And it's been quite a journey. And I hope you join me for it. This book focuses on Kekkonen's first term, which began in 1956, when he barely won the presidency, and ends with the ending of his first term in 1962. And the reason that this book focuses on that term is because it was during that term that Kekkonen laid the foundation for both Finland's post-war relationship with the Soviet Union during what is still known as the Soviet time, and also for his presidency, which lasted forever. Well, not quite forever, but for a long time. 1/4 of Finnish history was Kekkonen. So, and yet there was no one book which really explained how did Kekkonen stay in power for so long? And what was so interesting and so special about him? And why is he still controversial? He's still the most controversial figure in Finnish history. So that gives you some idea of why I wrote that book and why I focused on that crucial first term. Another reason why I wrote the book, or why it was very interesting to me, is because I'm very interested in the Cold War, which technically lasted from the end of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Kekkonen's presidency also overlaps most of the Cold War. People forget, even though it was called the Cold War, people forget how hot it actually became. And of course, the war got to its hottest in 1963 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Mr. Khrushchev, who was a good friend of Kekkonen's, decided to put some missiles in Cuba. And Mr. Kennedy, persuaded Khrushchev to take them out. 2 years before that, the Cold War it started getting really hot in 1961 after the Berlin Wall was built. And it was also at that time when Finland played a major supporting role in the Cold War. It was at that time when President Kennedy, who took office at the beginning of 1961, he was trying to figure out what made Mr. Khrushchev do what he was doing. And that's why he invited Kekkonen to Washington for 2 days to figure out, because Kekkonen was the Western leader who had the best relationship with Khrushchev and who actually managed to get Khrushchev into a sauna, which is a great achievement. Most of you, or many of you, probably have heard of the note crisis, which was technically Finland's greatest crisis, post-war crisis. That's when the Soviet Union decided to invoke the article in the treaty that it had with Finland that Finland had to conduct military conversations with the Soviet military. And a lot of Finns were worried that that was just a step before the Russians were going to invade. And that was the note crisis. At the peak of that crisis, Kekkonen went off to Siberia to meet Khrushchev. It was very brave of him because those were the days when Aeroflot had maybe 1,000 accidents a year. To give you an idea of how involved America was, and this includes the American media. This was in 1960, 60, 61, Finland was still front page news. President Kennedy wanted Kekkonen to know that America was behind Finland, whatever Finland decided. And he basically implied that, well, he didn't really say exactly, but he was prepared to do anything that Kekkonen wanted. And at one point, and this is how the book begins, the American ambassador to Helsinki, Bernard Guffler, went on a secret mission to Tamaniemi, that big house outside of Helsinki, which is now a museum. And Ambassador Guffler had a message from President Kennedy. And you can find out what that message was exactly when you read the book. A month before the note crisis reached its apogee, a month before Ambassador Guffler made this secret mission to Tamaniemi, Kekkonen and Kennedy had a 2-day-long coffee clutch at the White House. I spend about 40 pages of this book dissecting that meeting. And it was a very interesting meeting from several points of view. For one thing, it's the only meeting that Kekkonen took. You know, Kekkonen was a man who prided himself on taking meetings with important people. But there's no transcript of any of these meetings. You know, the meetings, all the meetings took with the Khrushchev. You know, Kekkonen went to Soviet Union 30 times, but there's no transcript except in the KGB files, you know, of what was actually said. One of the interesting things about the meeting that Kennedy took with Kekkonen is that there's a record of it. Actually, there are two records of it. There's the State Department record, and then there's the record that was taken by one of the people who was at that meeting, who also happened to be my mentor with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was assistant to President Kennedy. And he kept his own record of this meeting in his diaries, which I was given access to. You can see in this meeting, and I really sort of relate that meeting in real time in the book, you can see they're basically, these two leaders are sort of taking the measure of each other. If Kekkonen was a great man, you know, you can see it in the way he dealt with Kennedy. They were sort of on the same level. I think they both were great men. And they were both great men with asterisks, you know, great men, but, you know, Kennedy had his thing with his women, you know. And Kekkonen did too, but not during the first term, really. Kekkonen was a liar. He was very Machiavellian, you know. He said what he felt people needed to hear. But actually, in this meeting, he was probably more honest than he was in any of the meetings he ever took. And that's in the transcript. And I have to say that was the most fascinating aspect of the book for me, was dissecting that meeting. And I think if you read the book, you should be interested in it too, whether you're a Finn or an American. One of the reasons that this meeting was of special significance to me was because I knew two of the people who were at the meetings. Arthur Schlesinger, who was assistant to President Kennedy and who later was a professor of history. He was my professor of history. And then there was Max Jakobsen, the great Finnish diplomat, who later became a great historian in his own right, and who was one of the people who encouraged me to write my first book about the Winter War. And of course, Jakobsen was very close with Kekkonen. One of the interesting things about this book was the people I was able to interview for it. One thing led to another, and I was able to get an interview with Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, who just died last year. And Sergei was an advisor to his father. It took a long time, but somehow 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I found myself in Sergei Khrushchev's house in Rhode Island. Sergei moved to Rhode Island after the Soviet fell apart. And I felt that, if anyone really knew what his father's motives were during the note crisis, why did, ultimately, as you already may know or probably know, Khrushchev let up on Finland. Russia did not invade Finland. Was he trying to help Kekkonen get reelected? And you'll have to read the book to find out what he said, but it was an interesting moment there. And Sergei finally told me what motivated his father, and that was one of the high points of my research for this book. Kekkonen, it's a cliche, but Kekkonen was a very complicated man. And he was probably the most complicated man I've ever had to write about. The moment I felt I knew him, there was another room that I didn't know about. Writing about Kekkonen, it was like entering a house with like 40 rooms, and you never know which door led to the next door. So the moment I felt that I liked him, and I did like him, he was a funny guy. I wouldn't say he was a nice man, but the most important thing about Kekkonen, and the thing that I respected about him the most, is that what he did, whatever he did, including the shortcuts that he took, including the moral shortcuts, he did for Finland. He really loved this country. Of course, the problem was that he thought he was Finland. And in that respect, the other world leader who he resembled the most to me was Charles de Gaulle, who also felt that he was the personification of France. Kekkonen felt that he was the personification of Finland, So that takes a little bit of hubris, So, but I think that's the most important thing to remember about Kekkonen. Whatever you think about Kekkonen, whether he did too much to help the Soviets or too little, or, he wasn't doing it for himself, at least at first. He was doing it for Finland. And of course, ultimately, he wound up thinking that he was indispensable. And that's the tragedy of Kekkonen, is that he fell in love with power, ultimately. But I think that's the most important thing, is that what he did was for Finland. He was good friends with his wife. He loved his wife. I think Sylvie was his best friend. I don't know what kind of relationship they had, but I think Sylvie was his best friend. He disposed of people. One of the things I didn't like about Kekkonen was that I think he was very manipulative. He used people. And that's one of the reasons why I feel he was a great man with an asterisk. But I still think that, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that I cannot imagine what Finland would have been like then And I still even can't imagine what Finland would be like today without Kekkonen. I mean, he is really the missing link in Finnish history. And the reason that I wrote the book, one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because everyone thinks they know Kekkonen, but they really don't know Kekkonen. And hopefully that my book will help answer some of the questions that people have about him. Well, I put a lot into this book. I mean, if I had known that this book would take me 8 years and a fair amount of expenditure and hiring 8 assistants and reading 3,000 documents, and I mean, I put more into this book. I've written 7 books. I put more into this book than any book that I've written. And the only reason to write a book like this is because if there's a need for that. And I really felt there was a need for this book. And ultimately, I like to think it's my gift to Finland. And I hope that, and I'm sure it will find the readership it deserves. And thank you for joining me.